Ndala, 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 ndala. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today's video is based on your votes. For those of you who voted on my community page to have this subject made in a video, thank you. Over 100 of you voted, and the first subject that you chose was, in fact, for me to talk about the ego in African spirituality. So thank you so much for you guys who voted. This was for me just a way to see how interactive you were with my content. So this is not something that I necessarily going to do again. I do wanted to let you know that I started a Patreon page. So for those of you who want to support the channel, who want to submit or want exclusive videos, join the Patreon and support it. If you have other idea in terms of rewards that I can provide you, that will be also you will find that information within the Patreon once you join. Information for my Patreon and my PayPal donation link will be in the description box. For those of you who are new, welcome, welcome, welcome. Dala means welcome. I also wanted you to make sure that you subscribe and that you hit the notification bell to make sure that you receive notification when I'm going to be uploading. And depending on how many supporters I get on Patreon, it may enables me to make a lot more video a lot more frequently. So welcome, have a sit back, lay back, and let's go to today's subject. So the ego in African spirituality. Before we go into that aspect of African spirituality and how that concept and how to explain the perception of that concept within that context, we'll spend a little bit of time in terms of seeing my perception on the concept of ego generally and how he relates to some form of behavior or some form of perception and utility, the way that people utilize that terms. So first of all, in terms of defining what is the ego, there are many definitions out there. Some definitions say that the ego is this intermediary between your conscious and your subconscious mind. Other people will say that the ego is how you perceive yourself, your self-esteem, your pride. It's kind of sometimes used as a distorted version of yourself. It's oftentimes seen as something negative. And depending on which system or which culture you are in, it may be seen as something that you need to control, something that you need to destroy, especially when you disagree with somebody. So for me, the perception of the ego as an intermediary, as something that's a perception of who you are, which means that it's something that's detached, that's somewhat detached and distinct from you. It's something that you can put aside. This is why you will hear oftentimes people say, that's your ego speaking, insinuating that it's not you. It's that part of you that's probably negative, that's probably prideful or what have you. It's oftentimes when people refer to your ego, they refer at it from a negative or pejorative perspective. It's very rare that people will refer to the ego as something positive, as something trustful. And for those of you who've watched previous videos from me, you know that for me, the ego is not something to be destroyed. The ego is not something to be ashamed of, and the ego is certainly not something negative. To me, the ego is just a tool like a child that needs to be trained so that it can do what it actually mean to do, meaning that this is your pride. This is the element that it's supposed to protect your self-esteem from people. When people want to take advantage of you or abuse you, this is when this mechanism is supposed to kick in. This is not something that is supposed to be overwhelming, over negative or anything like that. It has a very important role to play to me. So I do not advocate destroying the ego. I advocate more retrain your ego. If your ego is not serving you well, it's not serving you towards the direction that you want to go, towards the goals that you want to achieve, and serving and supporting the relationship that you want to nurture, then I really highly advise you that you should retrain it. So that will be a subject of another video. Let me know below if you will be interested in how to retrain your ego, or discussion around that subject matter. Now, given that the ego is oftentimes perceived as something negative in most spiritual systems, in most spiritual discussion, you can hear many spiritual teachers telling people to, or their followers or their students telling them to destroy the ego, stop your ego from speaking. This is your ego acting out. And to me, that kind of behavior, that kind of perception, for me, equate what is often used in other religious system or in other spiritual system as a scapegoat, as a way to distance yourself from the responsibility that is yours in terms of the decision that you make, the action that you take. And sometimes it can even prevent you from taking on that responsibility and fixing the things that you've done wrong, or the people that you've wronged, making things right. And I think that's important when we're talking about having relationship with others and interacting with others in a very beneficial or conducive way, in terms of societal harmony. Okay, if you're not into societal harmony and having conducive relationships, so I guess this is not going to be interesting for you, and this is not going to be beneficial, because if you don't care about building relationship with others, then you can do however you please, and won't really care about whatever comes your way. But for those of us who are on a path where we want to be in harmony with the environment, in harmony and building strong, lasting relationships, fulfilling relationships, relationships that are trustworthy, relationships that we can nourish and make grow, it may be important to look at the ego in a very different kind of way, not as an enemy, not as something that's out of control, not as something that needs to be destroyed. And African spirituality can bring you that aspect, I think, that I haven't seen in many other spiritual systems, or even in many religions, in the sense that in the African spirituality perspective, you must take responsibility for your actions. There is no skirt gaping. There is no blaming on something else. There is no distancing yourself from the action that you've done, or the thoughts or the perception that you've taken on. You have to own that, and you have to address that and own that responsibility, the responsibility that comes with it, and the consequences that follows. So before I go into that, I will say that a lot of time the ego is being seen or is being used for individual in order for them to escape their responsibility. This is when somebody can do something wrong or wrong someone else and say, okay, that was my ego, as a way to sometimes escape taking the actions to make things right, and justifying it as that was my ego, now I know better. But oftentimes it doesn't follow with correcting. It doesn't follow with taking the steps to actually undo what you've done, or even attempting to do it. Now, for many of you, this kind of perspective of this kind of behavior may seem very familiar, especially for those of you who used to be Christian or who are religious, in the sense that in many religious systems, you can simply blame certain of the action that you've taken into being influenced into the devil made me do it, for example. This is a common phrase where you escape responsibility for the choices you've made. Again, this is not to say that there are no negative energies or negative entities around. Of course they are. However, even when those entities try to influence you, you still have a choice. You make the choice to, I don't know, drink alcohol and beat up your spouse or whoever. Okay, and even what is ironic actually, when you look at the example that I just gave, such as somebody drinking alcohol, spilling out of control, and maybe hitting or being violent towards a spouse or a family member or a friend or whoever. Okay, when you look at it from that perspective, yes, the influence of alcohol can make you do things that you don't really control, that you may even lose consciousness while you're doing those actions, right? However, if you look at any Alcoholic Anonymous or any program for alcoholics, in order to help and assist people who are suffering from alcoholism, the 12 steps program always include taking and assuming responsibility for one's action, meaning that for a few of the first steps that a person who wants to recover from alcoholism must do is to go and correct the wrong that have been done. So you can't just blame it on the alcohol. You also have to take the responsibility that despite the alcohol, you decided to drink, you committed to those actions even though you were under the influence. And now that you've sobered up, now that you realize all of that, the logic consequences of that is that you will try to make things right. Okay? And it says try. It doesn't say that you necessarily will, simply because some of the people you hurt may not even want to speak with you. They may have moved away. They may have passed away. There may be things that you cannot physically do to actually put them back in order. However, the intent behind is that you must try. You must take this action. You must recognize that you've done something wrong, and that you've wronged other people, that people suffered because of your action, because of what you've done, and you must attempt to make that right. So there's no escaping, there's no blaming the alcohol for you to escape the responsibility that is yours, not in terms of the legal system, but more in terms of your own self and how you view that. Okay. Now, when you set this aside and you look at the religious, there's many religious systems or even spiritual system where the individual try to find a scapegoat, try to find a way to distance yourself from things that you've done wrong, from the people that you've hurt, from the actions that you see now that are not that beneficial. And instead of assuming the responsibility and the consequences of it, you try to distance yourself by blaming it onto something else, by looking into a scapegoat. And that scapegoat often changes name. One example is to say to blaming on your ego. Well, I don't know what I was doing. My ego took over. Some other people will blame it on alter persona that they create. Oh, this is my online persona. That online persona is a troll, is out of control, what have you. But there's never an apology from the actual person who created the persona, the person behind the mask, the person behind the actual act. And similarly in religion, some individual may say, the devil made me do it, this entity made me do it, or blaming on this and blaming on that, without taking full responsibility. Now, this is very distinct from people who acknowledge that they were under bad influences from their friends and family, or negative entities or whatever, but still take responsibility for it. Meaning that they can say, well, my ego was acting up, but let me make this right. Okay, this is a very different scenario. I'm talking about when those specific terms, such as ego, such as the devil, and so forth and so on, are being used in order for somebody to distance themselves from the responsibility that is theirs. Okay? So now, when you think about African spirituality, and I'm gonna present this to you in two ways: the ancient way and the modern way, the actual current way. So in the ancient way, if you look at Mad, for a lot of you, if you're not familiar with Mad is simply a spiritual system that was built and nourished in ancient Egypt, and which you can find a playlist. I'll try to put a link at the end of the video or in the description box where you can see my Mad videos, or you can search them and find them easily on YouTube. So in terms of the Mad principle and how you perceive Mad, which is justice, which is truth, which is the embodiment of trying to live your life the most rightfully possible, in a way that is in harmony with the environment, with others. In that specific system, there is no ego, there is no escape. This is why at the end of the day, at the end of your journey, the scale come into play in terms of, do you have a light heart? They're not waiting in your ego. They're waiting in the action that you've made your entire existence, your entire life, the thing that you've done, the thing that you've said, the hurt that you've caused, the goodness that you've caused as well, so forth and so on, and assessing that and say in the imagery and saying that whatever is weighing on your heart based on what you've done and said and thought or what have you must be lighter than a feather. You must be very light. So there is no hiding behind the devil, hiding behind demons, or hiding behind white supremacy, or hiding behind any form of concept, because at that moment it's just you, your soul, and that feather. So in that sense, African spirituality does not allow you to blame it on somebody else, blaming on the ghosts, blaming on this, and blaming on that. It's just you. You own what you've done. And the consequences of that, meaning not just the consequences of what you've done, but also the consequences of how you try to maybe amend what you've done, correct it, and so forth and so on, is all weighted in the balance. And that's the beauty of it somehow, because it's not one of those fatalistic system where, you know, you steal a cow and you're a sinner and you get stoned to death and that's the end for you, or you do this and you go to hell and stuff. That's not how it works. It's more what you've done and what you did subsequent to that. So whatever you've done to correct it, to try to correct it and so forth, is also taken in consideration. And whatever else you've done, not just this particular thing, but everything in its totality. So it's a much more grounded and well-rounded perspective, because it doesn't allow you, there's no room for you to hide behind a mask, to hide behind someone else. It's just you, yourself, and what you've done. All of what you've done. So from that ancient perspective, there was no ego for you to hide behind. It doesn't mean that the ego did not exist. The concept of what the ego or the term ego represents did not exist, because there is a mechanism that enables you to be aware so much of your conscious and your subconscious, which is sometimes referred to as the ego. However, the modern concept of ego, which is this negative force or this negative persona perception that is distinct from the self, is not the perspective that's being taken. You are responsible for what you do. You are responsible for how you address the consequences of your own actions. And you are responsible for the perception that you have of what is happening around you, what is happening for you, or what is happening to you. And there's no escaping that. There's no magical door. There's nothing that will prevent you from escaping that. So this is from the ancient perspective. This is what, at the end of the day, bring out the scale, and it's just you, your heart, and that feather. Nobody else, nothing else. And this is translated in modern African spirituality, because similarly, there is no concept of ego. There is no concept of something else. There is no concept of you hiding from the responsibility that is yours, or from the consequences of your own actions. There is no concept of you having to wait or take responsibility for those things in some other life, at some other moment, or escaping that just because you are realizing it. There is no born again. There is no erasure of everything you've done without you correcting the thing you've done. So this is why in African spirituality, when somebody did something wrong, we use different tools and we address the person himself. We don't blame it on something else. We don't blame it on the person's pride or ego or anything like that. You've done it, you have to own it. There's no escaping that. There's no hiding behind anything else. And I do have to make distinctions. I know some of you are going to come out of woodworks and say, in my tribe, this and that and that. Yes, there are nuances, there are declinations depending on your own traditions, depending on different traditions in Africa, for sure. I'm speaking from my own perspective and from my own tribe, my understanding of my traditions and traditions that I've seen, traditions that I've lived in different African countries, and my own perception. So if you have a different experience and you're seeing it differently, you can put it down in the comments. Please, when you do that, please state which country you're referring to, which tribe you're referring to there, so people have a clear distinction and a clear reference if they want to look at what you are stating or simply learn more. Now, I do have to also state that there's something that's very different between the modern phenomenon and tradition. And for the outsider, for the onlooker, it may seem very blurry. Everything looks the same. So, for example, if you look at traditional culture in Kenya, if you go to Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, the culture there is very different from those of the Maasai, which is a traditional tribe that has tradition, that follows the traditions. So somebody who's from the Maasai tribe but who decides to live in the city, to decide to live in the cultural aspect of the city, and who's no longer following tradition, yes, it's still part of the African culture, but it's not part of the traditional culture. And you have to make that distinction, because you can go to modern times and see that terms such as the ego, people are starting to translate that term into African language because it didn't exist in our language. It didn't exist in those languages. And as we get more and more interdependent and with the exchanges with the rest of the world, certain concepts, certain words are being translated or even being invented in those languages. So it's not because you can find a reference or somebody saying, well, this is what it means. So you have to research back and to see if this concept was actually, if this word was brought in as a consequence of interaction with people who were talking about it, therefore we needed to find a way to express it in our own language, or if this is something that actually was already within our language and our culture. And one way to see that is to look at tradition. Tradition will show you if this is not something that people were doing, that means it's something that's new. That means it's something that's not in there. Or that means even if it was something that people were doing, it was excluded, it was rejected, and that's why it didn't make it all the way to here, to now. So anyways, all of this is to say that if you haven't watched my video on the devil in African spirituality, I would recommend that you go watch it, because it will give you some background. It will help you understand that in African traditions or culture, there is no heaven. There is no hell that people must look to after this life. There is, however, the spirit world, which is very different from the concept of hell and heaven. And I will suggest that you watch that video so that you may, it may answer some of the questions that you may have. Before you post your questions here, just watch that video so it may actually answer one of the questions that you may have. So this concept of that you can pretend, or you can blame it on, being weak, or whatever else that was happening to you, does not make into play, because the essence of correcting things is not necessarily based on your intention. You can have very great and wonderful intention and still do something that's horrible and something that's negative. That's something that's detrimental to the community or to your family or even to yourself. Okay, and then you can just blame that on phenomenon, etc. It doesn't mean that we don't take in account the fact that you may have been influenced by negative entities. You may have been manipulated. You may have made a wrong judgment call. You may simply have made a mistake too. So that also happened, and that's recognized that people will make mistake. Okay, so it's not a matter of forcing you to be perfect or attempting to push you to be perfect, or requiring that you exalt a perfect behavior or perfect understanding of everything. It's not that has nothing to do with that. It's rather acknowledging that when you do something wrong, you must go and fix it. You must own it and go and fix it. And if you don't, then there are consequences for that. Simply the same way that when you do something that's right and all of that, there are also consequences for that. And consequences in itself is not negative. It can be positive, it can be negative. Okay, it can go both ways. But you won't find anything to hide behind. And that's very important. When we use tools such as the tree of words, which was one of the subjects we had to vote for. The tree of words is a tool, is a process through which you come there with the truth, and the truth only. Everyone is only interested in the truth during that process. And in that process, you can't hide behind excuses. You can't hide behind anything else. You have to come forward and basically lay down and be, in some ways, naked before the truth. And so there is no room to speak of the ego in a Western kind of way. There is no room to speak of the ego as something that's distinct from you. You create and build and nurtured or train your own ego. So the ego is part of you. The ego is going to be part of your maybe reasoning process, of your decision-making process, whatever process is going through to help you take action, basically. So when you do something that hurts someone else, you can't just blame it on the ego, because you are the person behind the ego. And it's important that you realize that you need to own that. It's true, having a psychology background, I do understand the tool, why the ego is an important psychological tool, especially when you have people who are very sensitive. I'll put it that way, in the sense that some people, when they do something wrong or they even just make a mistake, they take it really to heart. They really start questioning themselves, questioning everything they've done that was even good or beneficial. They fall in such a deep state that using the ego to distance themselves is a tool, is a way for them to be able to look at what they've done without necessarily falling into this whole other journey in terms of questioning everything and everyone and everything, even thing that they've done in the past. Instead of focusing on the mistake that they've currently made and just looking at how to correct it, they will take a different path where they will start questioning everything else that they've done since the beginning. So the ego, seen as a tool that is distinct from you, can help those type of people distance themselves so they can just focus on that particular mistake in order to fix it, because that's what the therapist, the psychologist, or the health professional is supposed to help you do. So I can see the benefit of using that concept of the ego that way. However, for me, in my observation of most people and how it has been used, unless you are following therapy, and even that, I'll say it usually fails. The person is using this to distance himself, to avoid responsibility, and basically to keep going about, whatever they want to do. If they want to actually change, they will change. If they don't want to change, they will keep using the ego as a shield, maybe to escape responsibility, but sometimes also to escape shame. Because when you do something that's culturally wrong, that society doesn't approve of, you may feel some form of shame, or other people may shame you. Because that's the whole point of what the purpose of shame is often used, to make sure that you align with the agreed upon norms. And when you don't, then you get this feeling of shame. I'm not saying that it's right or it's wrong, anything like that. I'm just trying to explain to you how it may impact the way you seeing yourself and your use or concept or acceptance of use of the ego in a particular way. So in African spirituality, or in African cultures and traditions, the ego is a non-existent factor. We take it in consideration to say, okay, maybe your pride interfered and this is why you committed something that was not right. Okay, but in no shape or form can you hide behind that. And I think this is an important distinction to understand and to make, especially in modern times when people are using, for example, saying, well, somebody did juju on me, I was under a spell. And this is being used oftentimes in African culture, but also in other spiritual systems, where people will say, well, somebody did a spell on me, this is why I was acting like this, and that. I think there's a misunderstanding and a miscomprehension of how spell work works, or even what is quote-unquote called magic. Those things cannot work if you don't have those elements within yourself. And before you go around and say, well, this cannot work, no, everyone has some aspect of shadow. There is something that's less, that is a little bit less better than other things within yourself, within your personality, within who you are. That's why we all have a shadow. And this is why also sometimes we want to work on certain things. We want to work on not, carrying on trauma and things of that nature that are negative within ourselves. And that may bring us to do negative things that are not going to be to our benefits or to the benefits of the people we love or to the benefits of people around us. And anyone calling on those aspects of ourselves can push us to do things that we probably wouldn't want to do normally. Okay, and unless you've trained to not react to what other people are trying to call out of you, or unless you've worked on yourself to look at those different elements and to not let anyone external from you use them, it's going to be hard for you. It's going to be hard for you to control yourself in some ways. It's going to be hard for you to just stay focused. So that's really important to understand, that whatever somebody is calling on you, putting a spell or anything like that, they're actually just calling an aspect that's already within yourself, that they're trying to pull out, that they're trying to call on to. And this is what may be pushing you to do certain things or to react in a certain way, even when you don't quite understand it yourself. Okay, this is why the MAD, all of the spiritual system push you to work on yourself in order for you to know yourself, to discover yourself, to know your strength, but also know and understand your weaknesses. Work on your weaknesses, or understand how you can not let other people take advantage of those weaknesses. Okay, and so this is why when those things happen, even when there's a spell is placed on you and all of that, in some of the modern cultures in the cities and stuff like that, people will try to use the fact that somebody places a spell on them or influence them or what have you, to escape the responsibility that comes after they've done this action that caused hurt or pain or loss to someone else. Okay, in the traditional way, there is no escaping that. Even though the fact that the spell was cast or anything like that comes in as a factor to understand how things happened. However, you still have responsible for what happened. You still held responsible for what you are doing, and for your perception of things, and for the actions that you're taking or refusing to take when it comes to making it right. Okay, and in tradition, this is being seen as something that if you refuse to make something right that you've wronged, there will be consequences for that. Which is often referred to in everywhere else as karma. There's no escaping karma. Karma doesn't care that your ego pushed you to do it. All right? So it's aligned on that same kind of vibration. Karma doesn't care what you were really thinking at that moment or what else was going on. It's just, you've done this, the consequences are coming, and that's going to be the consequences. Now, as I said in other videos about karma, you can attenuate, you can even erase it simply by taking action when you're correcting. You've made a mistake, you correct it, then there won't be any negative karma if you manage to correct it before the actual consequences comes to play or come to fruition. And also the way it usually works is it's not because you're not doing anything, and it's not because other people are not viewing the consequences that things are still not happening. Okay, but that's another separate discussion. So if you have to retain anything else, is that in African spirituality, African tradition, there is no ego. You are responsible of the action that you put, the words that you express, that you use, the way you interact with other people. The consequences of that are yours. The ego is never going to be blamed. It's never going to be taking on that responsibility. And this is just part of the cosmogony and how we perceive the responsibility that each individual has. And I think I've mentioned this even in my videos when I speak about pregnancy and children, that we don't look at children as informed, non-knowledgeable beings. We speak to them as we speak to adults. We don't do the goo goo gaga language, okay? We will speak to a child and say, you're supposed to be asleep because it's at night. We will explain as we will explain to another adult. We don't necessarily we use the words that the child is going to understand, but we're speaking the child as it is an ancestor that came back. This is not somebody who doesn't know anything. This is somebody that you're talking to as a reference. It's oftentimes that a grandmother will speak to the child as another grandfather or grandmother as well, and that also feeds into that you won't be able to escape in blaming this in something else, blaming this on your mom, or blaming this on your age because you're young. Granted, we take in consideration that the expectations and what is expected of you it's gonna vary and increase as you get older in this body. However, on a spiritual level, the expectation is always the same. We always expect you to do your best. We always expect you to take responsibility for what you're thinking and what you are doing. And of course, in the best environment, we guide you so that this process of learning is one that is fulfilling to you and to the people who are around you. So of course, I hope this was useful. You can leave your comments, your questions below. For those of you who join Patreon, you can add on the discussion there. If you also want to submit or ask me to do a follow-up video on that, I was planning to do a part 2 to this specific video for my Patreon subscribers. So if you're not on Patreon yet, you can join. And for everyone else, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you and bye.